Warm welcome and greetings of the day to all the students and learners of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar Open University. This is related to your MBA course Managerial Communication, and today we shall be dealing with the topic barriers to communication and how can these barriers be overcome. Now basically what happens is, when we say communication, we are trying to say a common understanding between the sender and the receiver of the message. Now to establish this common understanding, the sender should be in a position to understand the receiver and the receiver should be in a position to understand the message. But in the process of doing so, there are a lot of obstacles or problems which can come. So barrier basically is any obstacle or any problem which can come in the process of communication, which will obstruct or hinder the entire communication. So when you are saying that, if the person is able to communicate effectively, the effectiveness may be lost only when there is some problem, some obstacle, some hindrance or a barrier in the entire process of communication. Several types of barriers can be there which can be experienced when you are trying to communicate. These can be classified as the first, physical or environmental barriers. The barriers which are there in the surrounding are called as the physical barrier. When I am speaking, whatever are the things which are there around me, if those are creating some kind of a disturbance or stopping me to communicate effectively, those are called as physical barriers or environmental barriers. The situation, the place where I am talking, the equipments which are there around, the kind of seating arrangements which are being made, or the kind of mechanisms, machines which are there, all of them can bring about a disturbance in the entire process of communication. That are called as physical or environmental barriers which are there. The second are barriers which are related to language. Now different languages which are being used or differences in the language which are being used, that can create a problem in the communication. So language barriers are also called as semantic barriers or linguistic barriers. When the barrier is in the language of the speaker, when the speaker is using language which is not understandable by the receiver, then semantic barriers will come. The third are psychological barriers. Barriers which may be coming on account of the mindset, on account of stress, on account of psychological problems, are all called as psychological barriers which can be there. Those are also a part of it. Next can be socio-cultural. The barriers which can be there on account of differences in the social status, in the culture of the people. Many a times people face difficulty in understanding what is being communicated because of all these kinds of barriers which are there in the society or in the culture that are being followed by the sender and the receiver. And then there are barriers which are there in the company itself. Organizational barriers which can be there, barriers which can be there on the person, the people who are speaking, their emotions. So personal and emotional barriers can be there. So a broad classification of all these barriers can be understood as semantic barriers, which is barriers related to language, psychological barriers, barriers because of the mindset of both the receiver as well as the sender, organizational barriers, barriers which can come or problems which can be there in the company itself, and then personal barriers, problems or hindrances on account of the person which are stopping him or her to communicate or receive the communication effectively. This is the four broad classification of all the barriers which are there. Then there are some other barriers which are also examined in the process of communication. Let us discuss all these barriers in detail now. The first one are physical barriers. The barriers which are there in the surrounding, in the environment, they may also create problems and confusion in communication. Under that, the first one is noise. Now in a factory or in an office, there can be noise on account of machines which are being used. In a production floor, there can be a lot of machines in terms of equipments, production units and all, because of which noise can be emitted. that noise creates a barrier in communication. So noise pollution is one of the biggest contributor to the environmental barriers which will stop people from communicating effectively. Noise is one barrier which can be there. Second, under physical barriers is time and distance. Physical distances which are there between people can also create major problems in communication. Time zones across the world may be different, because of which effective communication may not happen. We see so many labor who migrate from one place to another, skilled and unskilled. They are far from their families. So therefore, time zones of these people are different. So when they are communicating back to their families, you would have differences in the time zone. Because of the COVID pandemic, we have seen that the entire world was working in a virtual setup, where we had people connecting with one another from people of different parts of the world. So there again, time zones were different. You have employees who work in a back office, that is outsourcing center, where they may be working in the night shift, and then the person who is calling in that call center may actually be having a day on their end. So the way they communicate and the way these people receive, that may be different, because there is a difference in the time zone, there is a physical distance between these countries. So people will have to adjust for all these kind of differences which are there in the time and the physical distances which are there. The physical barrier can also be in terms of wrong selection of medium. The medium which I am choosing to communicate may also create a barrier. For example, when I am talking over the phone and communicating, when I am sending an email and communicating, or when I am using any intranet or social media and trying to communicate, if that medium which I am choosing to communicate is improper, then also the message will not be communicated effectively. So these are physical barriers which can be there in terms of noise which is there, time and distance between the people, wrong selection of channel which can be there, or the system which is used itself is also defective. For example, many a times we see that telephones, fax machines, computers, they all develop some kind of a problem in communication. Network for internet may fail. People who may be talking on the days, there may be a failure in terms of mic systems which can be there, sound and audio systems which are being used, excessive rains and natural calamities, that can also bring about a barrier in effective communication. Failure of power can also make the message redundant, or message may not be sent properly. All these are all barriers which may not make communication effective, because these barriers are present in the environment around. They are present in the physical situations in which the communication is actually taking place. So this is the first set of barriers which are there, which are called as physical barriers which can be there, where we are talking about barriers which are there in the environment around us. People who are trying to communicate in noisy environments, time and distances are too far, mechanism or medium which is chosen is faulty, and there are a lot of defects in the communication system only. That brings about barriers in the environment called as the physical barriers. Then there can also be barriers which are related to the health and fitness of the people. Disabilities of the people may make the message physically handicapped. The message itself may have physical incapability. People, when they are speaking, they can be barriers on the physical being of a person, where you talk about physiological barriers, these are called as, which are related to person's health and fitness. These may arise on account of disability which may affect the physical capability of the sender as well as the receiver. For example, if the vocal cord of a person is not functioning properly, the voice is not good, the person is suffering from cough or cold, then he may not be able to communicate well. Similarly, the person is speaking stammering, fumbling, utterances of improper words, all that may be a barrier in the physiology, that is the person's health and body of a person. Or even listening, when we are communicating, listening can also be defective when you are talking about people not listening properly on account account of their conditions of the ear which can be there, or writing can also be defective where you talk about a hand injury, or when you write continuously there can be numbness in the hand. These are all physiological barriers, barriers on the body of a person or health and fitness of a person. Reading, for example, which is also a form of communication, that also may be hampered when you have a poor eyesight which can be there, or when you are reading in a condition which has got poor lighting around you. All of these will bring about a barrier in the communication. So barriers which are related to health, physical well-being, fitness of a person or body of an individual, which may not help the person to communicate effectively, those are also called as your barriers, which are physiological barriers which can be there. Barriers related to not using organs of the body which are communicating properly as such. That is also one way. So barriers in the environment, physical barriers, barriers because of health, fitness of a person, physiological, or barriers related to the body. Then you have got the third one, which is very prominent, which are called as semantic barriers or language barriers. Now the word semantic refers to a systematic study of meanings of the words. So semantic barriers are actually related to language. They may cause obstruction in the process of receiving the message, understanding the message, during the process of encoding, decoding the ideas and the message which can be there. So what is the meaning that I am trying to convey when I talk? That is very essential. If that meaning is not conveyed, then it means that there is some kind of a barrier in the communication. It is called as semantic or language barrier. Under this, the first one is misinterpretation of words. Now different people may understand words in a different way. Same word may be having a different meaning for a different person. So in what context are you using that particular word? That is very essential there. So misinterpretation of words can also lead to barrier in the communication process. Then some of the people who are at workplace, because they are so used to using some technical words, they assume that the same words will be understood even by others, but that may not be the case. So use of technical language which is related to the profession, that is actually called as using technical jargon, but that technical jargon may not be understandable equally by everybody. So that also is a semantic barrier which can be there. For example, when is a new employee joining the company, if I am using technical jargon of production units, machines, or I am using technical words which are beyond his understanding because he is newly joined that particular profession, then it becomes very difficult to communicate in the beginning with that person. So use of technical language is a problem, a semantic barrier. Then vocabulary deficiencies. Both the sender as well as the receiver may be having a semantic barrier because they don't know many words. So vocabulary may be weak of both the sender and the receiver, then also communication will not be effective as such when vocabulary is deficient. Then multiple meanings, different words having different meanings. Connotative meaning. Connotation is basically an idea or a feeling which a word will invoke in a person in addition to the literal meaning. Say for example, if I am using the word discipline, the word discipline basically means abiding by rules and regulation, but along with the literal meaning, it will also communicate a very unpleasant situation where people usually don't want to abide by the rules and regulations which are there. The word like depart, go, leave, get out, all of these are the same words which can be used for going out, but then each one of them has got a different literal meaning and a different meaning which is actually assumed when you are speaking. When I say get out of something or get out of my class or get out of the meeting, that actually is very harsh. On the other hand, if I say leave or go or depart, that actually connotes something else. So the word may be meaning the same, but the feeling which it is trying to convey along with the literal word, that can also be different. So that is called as connotation which can be there. It is an idea or a feeling which a word invokes for a person in addition to the literal or the primary meaning which can be there. So that also is a semantic barrier. So this plays a very prominent role, all these barriers which are related to the language. different words having different meanings, misinterpretation of words, technical jargons which are being used, connotations which are being used, all of those are semantic barriers which can be there. So barriers so far that we discussed are physical, which are related to the environment or the setup in which I am speaking, the speaker is speaking. Barriers which are physiological, related to the fitness, health or physical well-being of a person. Barriers which are related to language, which are called semantic barriers, which are there. Next we come to personal barriers. Barriers because of differences in people, psychological makeup, mental makeup, mindset of the individuals, because all this will help a person to arise at judgment. It affects their emotions, the social values of the people get impacted. All this can create a barrier in communication. For example, attitudes and opinions, assumptions and negative feelings about a receiver. Whoever is the receiver of the message, if the sender of the message has got any negative feelings towards them, say in a say for example management and trade union, when they are wanting to negotiate on particular terms and conditions, if the management is already having an attitude and a negative feeling towards the trade union, or trade union is of the opinion that the management is not in their favor, and then they begin the conversation, then with that particular attitude and opinion which is already built in their mind, the communication may not be effective as such, because it will create indifferences between the subordinates and the employers of the company. They do not feel motivated as such. So that way attitude and opinion will become a barrier in communication. Similarly, lack of self-confidence. If either the receiver or either the sender is lacking self-confidence while communicating, then that also is a personal barrier which can be there. Similarly, connected to a person only, barriers which are related to emotions can also hamper effective communication, where you talk them about emotional barriers. For example, a blocked mind. When your mind is blocked and you have only limited information, or the receiver is ignoring or rejecting additional information with a very rigid and a dogmatic mind setup, if you continue, then in that particular case all new, innovative, welcome ideas will not be taken into consideration. So a blocked mind will not help the person to communicate effectively. Similarly, prejudices, biases which can be having, they all become reasons for neglecting or rejecting any message. For example, your prejudice about a person where you are in anger, you basically give back with a sharpness there or harshness there. So that becomes a barrier for you. Bias and prejudices which can be there. Then when the sender is worried, excited, afraid, nervous, all of that, the emotions which are there, that gets conveyed in the message that the sender actually is trying to communicate. Similarly, you have ego where you talk about where I am having great feelings and conflict in human relations, that can also cause a lot of barrier in the communication. Wrong opinion about the people, wrong opinions about, for example, castes and communities and religions, all of that can bring about negativity in communication, and prejudices actually are bias, or they are wrong opinions which can be there about a person. Similarly, there is something called as a halo effect, which we discussed during organizational behavior, where we are liking or disliking a person based upon some kind of characterization of that particular person, and then based on that we assume the person to be the same. So that way, that will also hamper the communication, where the person may not be exactly that. Similarly, your own self-image. If a person is feeling positive or negative about himself or herself, that also enhances or hampers communication. As an individual, what do you feel about yourself? If you are happy with your own self, if you are feeling positive about your own self, your communication also will be positive. On the other hand, if you are demotivated, if you are not happy, or you are not feeling well about your own self, similarly communication which will come out will also be negative, or it will hamper communication. And also filtering. When the receiver is receiving message, if the receiver is intentionally filtering the message to try to defend himself or protect himself, that also creates a lot of problems in the communication. It happens usually, when we try to punish children at home, there is filtering in the message that happens there. And also receiving message with a closed mind. Most of the time when communication happens, we have our mindset already on that particular topic or the content, so we are listening actually with a closed mind, and then we are unable to learn new things there. So that way, that also creates a problem in communication. Sometimes status also will create a problem in communication. Who is communicating, whether the person is a superior or a subordinate or a peer, that also creates a confusion and a barrier to the communication. Similarly, how do I perceive people around me? What kind of perception I have? People usually who have negative perceptions or think negatively, they look at all things around them also negatively. And people who have got a right perception about things, positivity, they will receive communication in a positive manner that way. Similarly, poor retention, ability to remember and retain the message is also very essential. Otherwise, communication will become very difficult there. And interest of a person, if the person is interested in listening, that particular interest will enhance the way it gets communicated. Lack of interest, wrong attitude, poor attention, all that will make communication improper and become a barrier. Most of the time, especially in classes, students have got the habit of daydreaming, where they are actually only hearing and thinking about something else in their mind when the lecture is going on or the talk is going on. That also obstructs communication. That's why we say, half learning of the students happen when they are actually listening well in a class. So that way, when that creates a psychological barrier when the student is not listening to what happens. All these barriers are actually coming from either the environment in which we are, or either who we are, what we think, what kind of a well-being we have. But there are also some barriers which are there in the organization where we are working actually. Say for example, you can have a barrier in terms of complex organizational structure. The organizational structure, the various levels in the company are too many, which can also bring about a barrier in communication. So organization structures which are very tall, long, where you have a lot of people to pass on from the hierarchy, that also will break down the communication which can be there, because the message has to pass through so many people. That can cause delay in the message, or it can bring about a total failure in the message as such. Time pressure. Timeliness also brings about effectiveness or ineffectiveness to communication. When messages are conveyed in time in an organization, that will make communication effective as such. So organizational barriers are also there in the company, where you are trying to understand what kind of an organizational policy is there, what are the rules and regulations which should be there for communication, who is communicating, what is the status of the communicator, what kind of complexity or simplicity do you have in the organizational structure. All that will bring about communication and make it effective or ineffective. Similarly, there are also barriers which are there in the culture around us or in the society around us. How do we understand culture? Culture basically is a way of life. What value systems we follow, what principles we follow, all that can create barriers between people, or it can help people understand one another. The way a person leads a life, the way a community leads a life, what kind of religious principles are being followed, what are the languages which are being spoken, all that is a part of culture as such and society as such. So in socio-cultural barriers, the first barrier that you have is concept of time. How is time perceived across culture? Usually what happens is, in most of the cultures, time is taken to be very important, but in some other culture, time is taken very leisurely. The concept of time is very essential in communication. When communication doesn't happen in time, at the time when it has to happen, if it happens after the time is over, then that communication will not be effective. So concept of time is very essential for communication to pass on to the communicator or the receiver of that particular message. Similarly, assumptions which you have about social stratas which are there, caste systems which are there, all of that are a part of a culture. So what kind of opinions and beliefs do you have about languages which are spoken, religions around, communities around, classes or divisions of the society around, that can make the communicator assume whether they are superior or inferior to others in the society while they are communicating. Similarly, what kind of mannerism is followed in the society? Every society has got their own mannerism and etiquettes to follow. That will include rules of behavior, a certain code of conduct that people follow, different forms, ways that we address people, that we respect people, formal and informal ways which can be there, that can create some kind of a confusion sometimes. So mannerism and etiquettes which are there. Similarly, body language of a person can bring about a misunderstanding, which is a part of non-verbal communication. Concept of space. In some culture, distance between people is not approved, whereas in some cultures, distances actually are to be approved. So that also becomes essential there. So socio-cultural barriers which are there. Apart from these barriers, which are physical, physiological, psychological, organizational, and the barriers which are related to social cultural, there are some other barriers which can also be there. Under that, the first one is filtering. Filtering is nothing but manipulation of the information by the sender so that he is obtaining favorable opinion from the receiver. When the employee is getting some information from the employer, and that information is getting manipulated so as to gain some favor, that is called as filtering, which happens. So that filtering also brings about a barrier in the communication process as such. Selective perception. When the receiver of the message is perceiving the message on the basis of his or her own needs, not understanding the message in its entirety, but understanding the message selectively, that also brings about a barrier. Then defensiveness. People intentionally attempt to block communication because they feel that the other person is threatening them, their prestige, their social status, their self-image, or they pass on sarcastic comments and judgment or question the motives of the other party. All that will also be a barrier, which will be defensiveness, which can be there. Similarly, now all these barriers which are there, it's not that all these barriers are all permanent ones, but there are easy methods of overcoming these barriers to make your communication effective. Firstly, whatever are the barriers related to perception, you can eliminate those differences in perception through understanding one another. Similarly, eliminate barriers related to language, where you're communicating using simple words, understandable language, clear words, not making language very complicated, so use of simple words. Similarly, noise levels which are there around when you're communicating in a formal setup like a company or a factory, not talking near machines, not talking near equipments which are constantly making noises, all that can make your communication effective as such. Active listening. Whoever is the receiver of the message, they should see to it that they are listening in a very considerate manner, not passive listening, not hearing, but they should be engaged in active listening so that the communication is made effective. Similarly, the emotional state of mind. Whenever the speaker is speaking, neutrality should be observed in a state of mind. Otherwise, when you are speaking with a distressed mind or upset mind, then that portrays in the speech as well. So therefore, the emotional state of mind when the speaker is speaking should be neutral as such. And also companies, they have to adopt a simple organizational structure. Hierarchical levels in the company should be optimum, which should be there, so that people are able to communicate very effectively with one another. Also, overload of information. When the employees are loaded with lot of information at once, that also brings about a barrier in communication. Forcing employees to work beyond working hours, giving them instructions or passing on circulars to them which are very heavy to understand, they all bring about grievances for them, which also results in poor communication. So that information and work overload should be reduced to avoid miscommunication with the employee. Similarly, constructive feedback. When there is a mechanism where the receiver of the message is able to tell the sender of the message feedback about the message which is being given, then also communication can be effective. So you can overcome the barrier by making feedback flexible or having a mechanism of feedback. Similarly, choosing media which is appropriate for the message which has to be sent, whether you are communicating through email, telephone, fax, letters, notices, circulars, all that effectively must have been used. So therefore, all the barriers which are there, which we discussed in this particular session, which are basically related to language, that is semantic barriers, the person who is speaking, the physical well-being or physiological barriers which are there, the environment in which the person is speaking, so the physical barriers which are there, barriers which can be because of the mindset, mental makeup of a person, so psychological barriers, or barriers which are there in the company structure, so we call it as organizational barriers which can be there. All these barriers can be overcome when there is a positive attitude about communication, when improved communication skills are being worked out, when there is a mechanism of feedback, when you make communication goal oriented, and then you accept the reality of miscommunication and try to avoid all that particular miscommunication which happens. So that way, in today's session we have spoken about all the barriers which are there, which hamper communication from becoming effective. So whoever are the people who are communicating, it is essential that they practice the principles of effective communication and overcome all the barriers which are involved in this process of effective communication. Thank you so much.